You don't have to understand this. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to do anything with these words. If you're moving, driving, or doing something that needs your attention, let this stay far away, like a sound that belongs to another room, like something you don't need to turn toward. And if you're resting or lying down or simply letting the night move around you, then nothing else is required. You don't have to listen closely. You don't have to stay with every sentence. You don't have to remember any of this later. This is not here to guide you. It's not here to change you. It's not here to help you become anything. Tonight, you don't have to mean anything. There is a quiet pressure many people carry without noticing. A pressure to be something, to matter, to be useful, to make sense, to make the moment count. That pressure doesn't disappear at night. Sometimes it gets louder. When everything else slows down, it starts asking questions. What did today mean? What does this say about me? What should I be doing with this time? But tonight, those questions don't need answers. They don't even need to be quiet. They can appear and fade without being followed. You don't have to turn your life into a message. You don't have to turn this night into something important. You don't have to extract meaning from how you feel. You don't have to be productive with your rest. Rest does not need to prove itself. The night does not need to justify its existence, and neither do you. You are not required to be meaningful right now. You are not required to be significant. You are not required to be understood. You don't have to stand for anything. You don't have to represent anything. You don't have to carry the weight of being someone. Tonight, you are allowed to be unimportant, not in a harsh way, not in a diminishing way, in a relieving way, in the way that takes pressure off, in the way that lets things soften. There is a difference between being meaningless and not needing to mean anything. This is not about emptiness. This is about freedom from expectation, freedom from having to matter, freedom from having to make sense. You don't have to turn your experiences into lessons. You don't have to turn your thoughts into insight. You don't have to turn your feelings into something useful. They can exist without purpose. They can pass without explanation. You might notice a reflex that says, "But everything should mean something." That reflex doesn't need to be challenged. You don't have to convince yourself of anything else. You can simply let the reflex rest. Not everything needs to point somewhere. Not everything needs to add up. Not everything needs to be part of a bigger picture. Tonight is not part of a story. It doesn't need a beginning. It doesn't need an ending. It doesn't need a message. It doesn't need a takeaway. You don't have to decide what this night says about you. You don't have to decide what it contributes. You don't have to decide whether it matters. Those decisions can wait. They don't belong here. The night is not a place for evaluation. It's not a place for judgment. It's not a place for reflection that leads somewhere. It's a place where things are allowed to exist without being assessed. You can let yourself be unremarkable. You can let yourself be undefined. You can let yourself be without value for a while. Nothing bad happens when value disappears. Nothing collapses. Nothing is lost. You don't stop existing when you stop being meaningful. In fact, many people feel lighter when that burden drops. The burden of having to be something. The burden of having to count. The burden of having to leave a mark. You don't have to leave a mark tonight. You don't have to take up space in a noticeable way. You don't have to be remembered. You don't have to be relevant. The night doesn't require contribution. It doesn't require effort. It doesn't require intention. You can simply be here or not be here without consequence. If thoughts come, let them come. If they ask what this means, let them ask. You don't have to answer. You don't have to respond. Questions can exist without resolution. Experience can exist without explanation. You don't have to hold yourself together. You don't have to hold an identity in place. You don't have to keep being you in the usual way. You can loosen the sense of being someone who matters. You can loosen the sense of being someone at all. Not because you are disappearing, but because you are resting from the effort of being defined. You might notice a quiet relief when nothing is expected of you. A relief that doesn't announce itself. A relief that feels like space, like silence, like nothing pressing in. That relief does not need to be named. It does not need to be appreciated. It does not need to be held. It can come and go on its own. You don't have to be grateful for it. You don't have to notice it happening. You don't have to think, this is working. Nothing needs to work. Nothing needs to succeed. Nothing needs to become anything else. Tonight, you don't have to mean anything. Not to the world, not to anyone else, not even to yourself. And that is not a loss. That is permission. Permission to stop trying to matter. Permission to stop explaining yourself. Permission to stop holding meaning in place. You can let the idea of importance fade. You can let the idea of value rest. You can let the idea of purpose step aside. There is no need to replace them with anything. Nothing needs to fill that space. The space itself is enough. You don't have to stay awake for this. You don't have to listen for something important. You don't have to wait for a moment of clarity. Clarity is not required. Understanding is not required. Awareness is not required. You can drift. You can blur. You can disappear for a while. Nothing will be missing because of that. This night does not need you to be meaningful. It does not need you to be present. It does not need you to be anything at all. And you can rest in that. There is another quiet pressure that often appears when everything slows down. A pressure that says, this time should be used. This moment should count. This night should be doing something. It doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it feels like restlessness. Sometimes like guilt. Sometimes like a vague sense that you're wasting something. But tonight, time does not need to be used. This moment does not need to justify itself. You don't have to make good use of the night. You don't have to get anything out of it. You don't have to turn rest into recovery. You don't have to turn stillness into improvement. You don't have to turn silence into something productive. The idea that time must be useful can rest. It doesn't belong here. Night is not a resource. It's not something to spend wisely. It's not something to optimize. It's not something to manage. Night is where usefulness dissolves, where nothing is expected to perform. You don't have to earn rest. You don't have to deserve it. You don't have to justify why you're allowed to stop. Stopping does not require permission. You are allowed to be still without purpose. You are allowed to be quiet without outcome. You are allowed to let time pass without extracting value from it. If a thought appears that says, I should be doing something, you don't have to argue with it. You don't have to convince yourself otherwise. You can let the thought pass without response. It doesn't need reassurance. It doesn't need correction. It can fade when it isn't obeyed. You don't have to be efficient with your rest. You don't have to make sleep meaningful. You don't have to improve because you're lying here. You don't have to wake up better. Nothing here is trying to fix you. Nothing here is trying to make you more functional. Tonight is not about improvement. It's about absence of demand. You might notice the mind measuring time, wondering how long this has been going, wondering how much is left, wondering whether something should happen soon. Time does not need to be measured. You don't need to know where you are inside it. Minutes can pass without being counted. Seconds can disappear without being noticed. There is no schedule here, no progress to track, no result to wait for. You don't have to make the night worthwhile. It is already enough without being anything else. You don't have to fill the quiet. You don't have to entertain yourself. You don't have to engage. You don't have to participate. The night does not expect contribution. It does not need your effort. It does not need your presence. It does not need your attention. You are allowed to let time move on its own. You don't have to accompany it. You don't have to supervise it. You don't have to be awake for it. You don't have to be asleep either. Those distinctions don't matter here. You may notice a subtle release when usefulness drops away. A release from having to justify existence. A release from having to explain why you're here. A release from having to make sense of how time is spent. Nothing is being wasted. Nothing is being lost. Nothing is slipping through your hands. Time is not leaving without you. It is simply passing, as it always does. And you don't have to do anything about that. You don't have to make the night count. You don't have to make yourself count. You don't have to prove that this moment was worth something. Worth does not apply here. Value does not apply here. Purpose does not apply here. This is a space without evaluation, without score, without outcome. You can rest without contributing. You can rest without improving. You can rest without becoming anything else. If your mind insists on usefulness, let it insist. You don't have to comply. Usefulness loses power when it isn't followed. Demand softens when it isn't met. The body understands this. It knows how to rest without a reason. It knows how to exist without a goal. You don't have to help it. You don't have to guide it. You can simply stop trying to make the night do something for you. It doesn't owe you anything, and you don't owe it anything either. This time does not need to be productive. It does not need to be meaningful. It does not need to be useful. You can let it pass freely, unclaimed, unmeasured, unjudged, and you can rest inside that freedom. There is a belief that sits very deep in many people, so deep it often goes unnoticed. The belief that being here requires a reason, that existence needs justification, that you should be able to answer the question, why am I here? That belief doesn't usually show up during the day. Daytime is busy. It gives you roles, tasks, purposes. But at night, when all of that falls away, the question can surface, and it can feel uncomfortable, as if you are supposed to be something, somewhere, for some reason. But tonight, you don't need a reason to be here. You don't need to justify your presence. You don't need to explain why you're awake. You don't need to explain why you're resting. You don't need to explain why you're listening. You don't need to explain why you exist in this moment. Existence does not require permission. It does not require explanation. It does not require usefulness. You don't have to earn the right to take up space. You don't have to defend your presence. You don't have to answer for yourself. You don't have to be here for something. You can simply be here or not be here, without cause, without purpose, without meaning. The idea that you need a reason can soften. It doesn't need to be argued with. You don't need to replace it with a better idea. You can simply stop feeding it. Reasons lose their grip when they aren't demanded. Questions lose their weight when they aren't answered. You don't have to tell a story about why this night matters. You don't have to tell a story about why you matter. Stories can rest. They don't belong here. This space does not ask for narrative. It does not ask for explanation. It does not ask for direction. It does not ask for intention. You may notice a subtle discomfort when reasons fall away, a feeling of openness, of groundlessness. That feeling does not mean something is wrong. It means something is no longer being held up artificially. You don't need to replace the reason with anything else. You don't need to fill the gap. The gap itself is safe. The gap itself is quiet. You are allowed to exist without a reason tonight. You are allowed to take up time without justification. You are allowed to be present without purpose. Nothing bad happens when reasons disappear. The body continues. The breath continues. The night continues. Everything moves on without needing an explanation. You don't need to check whether it's okay to be here. It is already okay. You don't need to convince yourself. You don't need reassurance. You don't need confirmation. The fact that you are here does not need to be validated. It doesn't need to be supported by logic. It doesn't need to be supported by meaning. You might notice the mind trying to reintroduce a reason, saying, "There must be something." You don't have to respond. You don't have to correct it. You don't have to replace it. You can let the thought pass unanswered, like a question spoken into an empty room. Nothing comes back, and that is fine. You don't have to be part of a larger purpose right now. You don't have to be moving toward anything. You don't have to be on a path. You don't have to be becoming someone. You don't have to be heading anywhere. You can rest without direction, without orientation, without reason. There is a quiet relief in realizing that nothing is being asked of you. No explanation, no defense, no justification, just being. And even that doesn't need to be noticed. You don't have to think, "I am existing without a reason." That would still be a story. You can let even that go. You can let the need to frame this disappear. You can let the night be without context. You can let yourself be without cause. Nothing is missing when reasons fall away. Nothing collapses. Nothing becomes unsafe. The world does not stop. You do not disappear. You simply stop carrying the weight of explanation. You don't need a reason to be here. And you don't need to remember that you don't need a reason. It can pass quietly, like everything else. There is a subtle habit that remains even after many things have softened. The habit of monitoring, of checking in, of making sure things are going the right way. The habit of holding the process together. Asking, "Am I doing this right? Is this working? Should something be happening now?" That habit doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It simply means the mind is used to being in charge, used to guiding, used to directing. But tonight, nothing needs to be managed. Nothing needs to be guided. Nothing needs to be steered. You don't have to make this moment unfold correctly. You don't have to keep it on track. You don't have to supervise your own rest. You don't have to watch yourself relax. You don't have to make sure you're letting go properly. This night does not require coordination. It does not require oversight. It does not require adjustment. You can let go of the role of manager. You can step away from the idea that you are responsible for how this goes. Nothing bad happens when control loosens. Nothing drifts into danger. Nothing falls apart. The body knows how to settle without instruction. The mind knows how to quiet without being told. You don't have to help it. You don't have to correct it. You don't have to guide it toward anything. If thoughts appear, you don't have to decide whether they should be there. If silence appears, you don't have to protect it. If rest comes, you don't have to deepen it. Everything can move at its own pace. You don't need to pace it. You don't need to keep time. You don't need to notice progress. You don't need to notice lack of progress either. There is no correct direction. There is no destination. There is no state you are supposed to reach. You can let the idea of doing this right dissolve. There is no right way for the night to unfold. There is no wrong way either. You are allowed to stop checking. You are allowed to stop adjusting. You are allowed to stop intervening. The impulse to manage may still appear, a subtle tightening, a moment of attention returning. You don't have to push it away. You don't have to engage with it. You can simply not follow it. Control loosens when it is not exercised. Direction fades when it is not applied. Nothing needs your hand on the wheel. Nothing needs your guidance. Nothing needs your permission to continue. The night knows how to be the night. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind knows how to drift. And you don't have to oversee any of it. You can step back completely, not away from something, but away from the role of directing. You don't have to check where you are in the process. You don't have to evaluate whether you're relaxed enough. You don't have to ask whether this is helping. Helping is not required. Effectiveness is not required. Outcome is not required. You are not here to achieve a state. You are not here to reach a result. You are not here to manage an experience. You can let experience manage itself. You can let the night unfold without your involvement. There is relief in that, a quiet relief, the relief of not being responsible for the flow, the relief of not having to hold things together. You don't have to keep the space open. You don't have to keep the silence intact. You don't have to make sure nothing interrupts. Interruptions don't ruin anything. Nothing is fragile here. Nothing needs protection. Nothing needs maintenance. You can let go of control without replacing it with trust. You don't have to trust anything. You can simply stop controlling. Control does not need an opposite. It can just fall away. And what remains does not need to be named. You don't have to stay alert for changes. You don't have to notice when something shifts. You don't have to track how deep this goes. Depth is not required. Stillness is not required. Even rest does not need to be achieved. You can let go of managing the moment and allow it to be unmanaged, unheld, undirected, free. There is nothing left to organize now, nothing left to adjust, nothing left to release. What remains does not need shape. It does not need structure. It does not need words. You don't have to stay with this. You don't have to leave it either. There's no position you need to take. No place you need to settle into. Attention does not need to be held. It does not need to be focused. It does not need to be wide. It does not need to be anywhere in particular. You can let it thin, like light at the edge of evening, not disappearing, just becoming less defined. Time can thin too. Moments don't need to follow one another. They don't need to be counted. They don't need to be noticed. There is no before you need to remember. No after you need to prepare for. The sense of being in time can soften, not forward, not backward, just less present. You don't need to know how long you've been here. You don't need to know how long this will continue. Those questions can dissolve. Nothing depends on the answer. The idea of me can thin as well. Not pushed away, not erased, just less solid, less central, less involved. You don't have to locate yourself. You don't have to feel like someone experiencing something. Experience can move without a center. Sound can exist without being heard. Quiet can exist without being noticed. You don't have to be aware of awareness. You don't have to observe yourself resting. You don't have to keep track of anything happening. Everything can happen without reference, without a point of view, without a witness. This does not require understanding. It does not require agreement. It does not require surrender. It does not require trust. It simply happens when effort is no longer applied. You don't need to let go. Letting go is already unnecessary. Nothing is being held. Nothing is being resisted. Nothing is being done. If thoughts appear, they can pass through thinly, like fog, like breath in cool air, visible for a moment, gone without leaving a trace. You don't have to follow them. You don't have to return when you notice you've drifted. You don't have to correct anything. Drifting is not a mistake. Blurring is not a problem. Losing track is not something to fix. There is no track. You don't need to remain present. Presence is not required. Absence is not a problem. There's no state to maintain, no level to stay at, no depth to reach. You can let everything become less distinct, less outlined, less named. Even the idea of resting can thin. You don't have to rest well. You don't have to rest deeply. You don't have to rest at all. There is no expectation, no requirement, no outcome. The night does not need your participation. It does not need your awareness. It does not need your permission. It continues quietly on its own, and you can continue without being involved. If there are long stretches where nothing registers, where sound fades, where words are no longer clear, that is not emptiness. That is space. That is where nothing is being asked of you. That is where effort has fully stepped aside. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to notice when you leave. You don't have to come back. Nothing is lost if you don't return. Nothing is missed. Nothing changes. Everything that needed to soften has softened. Everything that needed to loosen has loosened. What remains does not need attention. It does not need meaning. It does not need to be held. You can let everything thin out and allow what comes next or what doesn't, without involvement, without effort, without you needing to be anything at all. There is nothing left to arrive at, nothing left to understand, nothing left to release. This moment does not need your attention. It does not need your awareness. It does not need you. You don't have to stay with these words. You don't have to listen for anything important. You don't have to wait for something to happen. Nothing is about to begin. Nothing is about to end. Time can soften into something undefined, not moving, not stopping, just no longer organized. You don't need to know where you are in it. You don't need to know what comes next. Those ideas can fade without consequence. There is no need to remain present. There is no need to drift away. Both are equally unnecessary. The body can rest without instruction. The mind can quiet without explanation. Everything that needed to slow has already slowed. Everything that needed to loosen has already loosened. You don't need to check. You don't need to confirm. You don't need to notice. Sound can exist without being heard. Silence can exist without being noticed. Even this voice does not need to be followed. It can pass like air, like distance, like something happening somewhere else. You don't need to remember this. You don't need to forget it either. Nothing depends on what stays. Nothing depends on what fades. If there are long spaces where nothing registers, no words, no thoughts, no sense of time, that is not absence. That is rest. That is the place where effort has fully stopped, where nothing is being held together, where nothing is being asked. You don't need to stay here. You don't need to leave here. There is no here, only a quiet continuation, a thinning, a soft disappearance of edges. Nothing to hold, nothing to mean, nothing to manage, nothing to be, and nothing is missing.